Hello dear viewers. In this video, we are going to look at everyone's favorite spreadsheet topic, pivot tables. Pivot tables are great for summarizing and analyzing large quantities of data. And the beauty of Odoo Spreadsheet is that you can create pivot tables with live Odoo data. There are two different ways to do that. The first is to start from an Odoo pivot view and essentially push data to your spreadsheet. The second way is to start from an Odoo spreadsheet and pull in the data you need. We'll cover the basics of both methods in this tutorial. Whichever method you use, you'll be able to fully manipulate your pivot tables within Odoo Spreadsheet to get the insights your business needs. We'll cover that in more detail in our next tutorial. Ready to get started? Then let's go. For those of you less familiar with pivot tables, here's a little recap of how they work and some of the terms we'll be using. Pivot tables work their magic by grouping data into what's called dimensions. These are represented as rows and columns. In our example, adding the product field in the rows section gives us a list of all the products vertically, while adding the salesperson field in the column section displays all the salespeople horizontally. In this pivot table, our measure, that is what we are measuring, is the total sales amount. Each intersecting point gives us the total sales for the given salesperson and the given product. Here at Apex Original, our sales director wants a better understanding of how our salespeople have been performing over the previous quarters. We are going to start with the information in our sales app, so let's open that. Next, we'll open the reporting menu and check out the available reporting on our salespersons. We want to work with a pivot table, so we'll select the pivot view up here to the right. By default, this reporting view is showing us quantity order for our 4 salesperson. The row dimension with our salesperson is fine, but let's get rid of this column dimension by clicking on the minus icon, then add the order date, and we'll group by quarter. Let's also change the measure to total and remove quantity ordered. There's something worth mentioning here. We can, of course, tailor the view before we insert the pivot table into a spreadsheet, just like we are doing here. But we don't have to. Once we insert the pivot table into an Odoo spreadsheet, we can completely rebuild and manipulate it. For the moment though, let's just keep this one as it is and go ahead and click Insert in Spreadsheet. In the window that opens, we can rename our pivot. Let's just call it by order date. Next, we need to decide where to insert the pivot table. Here in the Spreadsheets tab, we can choose to insert into an existing spreadsheet, or we can insert it into a blank spreadsheet. By the way, when Odoo data is inserted into a blank spreadsheet, the spreadsheet is saved in the My Drive folder in the Documents tab. From the Dashboards tab, it's also possible to insert a pivot into an existing dashboard, or even to start creating a blank dashboard from scratch. For more about creating and customizing dashboards in Odoo, check out our documentation and other tutorials in this e-learning course. To keep things simple, let's go back to the Spreadsheets tab and select this Sales Analysis spreadsheet, and then click Insert. And voila, the pivot table is inserted into a new sheet in our spreadsheet. As soon as we insert a pivot table, the pivot properties open here on the right side of the sheet. This is where we could go further, configure a pivot table, and change the presentation and styling. These properties can be accessed at any time by right-clicking any cell of the pivot table, then clicking See Pivot Properties. There's another way too, and you'll see that shortly. So what are we seeing in our pivot properties? We can see the name of the pivot table, the model we've inserted from, as well as the fields that are being used for our columns, our rows, and our measures. Now that you've seen the mechanic of how to insert an Odoo pivot view into a spreadsheet, we're going to cover two very important topics that are important to understand if you're working with live Odoo data in a pivot table. The first topic that's important to understand is data sources. When we insert data from any Odoo view into an Odoo spreadsheet, or as we'll see later, create a pivot table using live Odoo data directly from our spreadsheet stays connected to our database, so our data is always up to date. In our example, as new orders are created in the current quarter, the data in the pivot table will update automatically. Updates happen when a spreadsheet is reopened, when the browser page is reloaded, or when the data is manually refreshed by clicking Data, Refresh All Data from the menu bar. So, how does that connection work? In fact, when we insert Odoo data into a spreadsheet, a unique data source is created. A spreadsheet can have many data sources connected to it, as you can insert data from multiple Odoo apps and models into the same spreadsheet. And you can always see which data sources are connected to a spreadsheet by clicking the Data menu. Data sources are grouped by the type of data, and hovering over each group shows the individual data sources present. Clicking on a data source here is another way of opening the side panel at any time. Data sources create the link between the spreadsheet and the database. They allow data to be retrieved from the database. They also let us access the underlying data by right-clicking any cell that has a formula calling our data source and selecting See Records. When we insert a pivot table like this, the pivot table is what we call a static pivot table, where each cell has a unique formula that retrieves data via the data source. We'll talk more about static versus dynamic pivot tables in a second. But first, let's click on a value and check out the formula bar to see how the spreadsheet is retrieving the value. This formula uses the Odoo specific spreadsheet function pivot.value. And if I click just after the first bracket, I can see the arguments. The first number is the pivot ID. In this case, 1, since it's the first pivot table that's been inserted into the spreadsheet. Next is the measure, price total. This is the technical name of the field containing the total amount of a sale, while sum tells that the amounts of each sale are simply being added together. The rest of the formula acts as a filter or domain. Each time we have the field used to filter and the value we are filtering on. For example, for the rows, user ID is the technical name for the salesperson field in the sales analysis report model, while 7 corresponds to the specific record ID of our salesperson Charlotte Tegas. Lastly, the columns. Date is the technical name for the order date field in the sales analysis report model, while quarter tells us the dates are grouped by quarter. Similar formulas are used to retrieve the values of the pivot headers. The second topic that's important to understand is the difference between static and dynamic pivot tables. When we insert a pivot table from an Odoo pivot view into a spreadsheet, like we just did, it's by default a static pivot table. As we saw, each cell contains a unique formula that retrieves up-to-date data from our database. However, let's say a new salesperson joins the team, or a new quarter starts. This static pivot table can't expand to accommodate a new row for that salesperson or a new column for the next quarter. Also, if we try to manipulate the pivot table, for example by flipping the axis, we get an error message and errors in our pivot table. So what do we do? If we want to make sure our pivot table can expand for new data, and if we want to be able to manipulate the dimensions and measures, we can convert our static pivot table to what we call a dynamic pivot table. There are a few ways to do this. I'll show you the easiest method in this tutorial. You can check out our documentation for other methods. So let's start by deleting these formulas that do no longer correspond to our dimension. Next, let's open the data menu. Before we actually reinsert the pivot table, we can notice the little warning icon beside the data source of this pivot table. This tells us that while the data source is still active, the data itself is not actually being used in the current spreadsheet. To reinsert our pivot table, let's continue down and click Reinsert Dynamic Pivot Table. Then we select the relevant pivot table, in our case, this one. A new dynamic pivot table appears. The pivot table remembers that we tried to flip the axis earlier, so let's flip them back to the original state, with the salesperson as the row dimension. Whereas before, each cell had a unique formula, now our dynamic pivot table only has one formula, which we can see if we click the top left cell. If we click just after the opening bracket in the formula bar, we can see that it's possible to have various optional arguments. We'll look at some of these in our next tutorial on manipulating a pivot table. This type of formula is called an array formula. That means the pivot table will now expand to accommodate, for example, a new salesperson or a new quarter. You might also notice that the styling has changed from the basic table styling we had before. Dynamic pivot tables have a specific pivot table styling, and in the next tutorial, we'll look at the Design tab to explore the display and styling options in more details. So, now for the second method of creating a pivot table that uses live Odoo data. And this time we're starting from within the spreadsheet itself. Earlier in this tutorial, we were looking at the sales performance of our salespeople. This time, we want to explore our sales performance at product level across our primary and secondary markets. In case you're wondering, our next pivot table will automatically open in a new sheet of our spreadsheet. So right now, it doesn't matter which cell is active. To insert the pivot table, we just click Insert, Pivot Table, then from Odoo Data. In the panel that appears, we enter the model that we want to retrieve data from. In our case, we want data about actual sales of products, and for that, we'll need the sales order line model. You can actually choose any model here, which makes this method extremely useful when there is no Odoo pivot view to start from. When we click Save, a new sheet opens with a pretty empty pivot table. Here at the top left of the sheet, the only thing that is shown is a count of the number of sales order lines. Just like any time when we insert a pivot table, we have our pivot table properties here on the right side. Remember we talked about static and dynamic pivot table? Well, when we insert a pivot table from within a spreadsheet, the pivot table is automatically a dynamic one. That means we could go ahead and add our columns, rows, or change our measures, but you're going to have to tune in our next tutorial where we pick right up from here. And that's it for this video. We've seen the two ways to insert a pivot table with live Odoo data into an Odoo spreadsheet. The first by starting from an Odoo pivot view, and the second by starting from within the spreadsheet itself. Make sure to join us in the next tutorial where we learn how to configure and manipulate pivot table. Thanks for watching.